Here with you tonight. I think this is going to be lots of fun. I hope it will be. I have some friends in the audience, some of my champions that I would like to give a shout out to. We have Dr. Mira Viswanathan, who's the head of our school, the Ethel Walker School, and the students call her Miss Viz. And we have with Miss Viz, Dr. Eric Widmer, her husband, whom the students call Mr. Viz. So welcome to them both. A special welcome also to my dear friend Nishet Isaac, who is our Dean of Students, to my beloved boss, Marion Patterson, who is our head Director of Alumni Relations, to Brett Benzio, who's our head of athletics, and welcome to all of you who put some time into your evening, put it on your calendar to come and to hear about the history of the Ethel Walker School. I'm thrilled that we get to do this. My name is Kim Harris Thacker. My email is up here, but I'll be happy to share it with you afterward as well. And I also want to express my gratitude to the public library for allowing me to do this, and to Simsbury Community Media for being willing to record this. I'm a big proponent of accessibility, and that's a big part of what I do, making things accessible. And to have this recorded really is a move into accessibility. So I really wanted to thank them for that as well. A little bit about me and who I am. I've been the archivist at Walker's for about 4 years. You'll be able to tell a little bit further into my presentation, I think, but I'm not from Connecticut. I have a Wyoming accent because that's where I'm from, is Wyoming. And my husband and I and our 2 daughters have lived here for about 5 years. Not only am I the archivist, but I'm also a teacher at Walker's, as is my husband, and our 2 daughters attend Walker's as a senior and a freshman. So I like to say that we are all in, including our dog Zuzu. She has like a Walker's collar. She's all in as well. And let's see a little bit more about Walker's itself. Before I talk about the past, we should talk a little bit about what Walker's is today. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on all things Walker's, but I do have this information from our Director of Admissions, Pam Safford, who also happens to be an alumna of the school, because we just can't get rid of our students even when they're adults. We love that Pam came back. There are 229 students at Walker's. It's a 6th through 12th grade plus postgraduate year school. It's a boarding and day school. We have 46 middle schoolers, and our middle school opened in 1990, and we have 183 upper schoolers. About 119 of our students are boarders, and of that 119, 25% are international students. And we have about 100 day students. And the first day students graduated 50 years ago with the class of 1974. So before this, we were strictly a boarding school. I love this picture. I think it showcases our lovely campus, especially our writing program. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the plan for tonight. I'd love to know, especially from those who are not Walker's employees right now, what are your attendee connections with Walker's? Are there any attendee connections with Walker's? I'll share with you my purpose for this presentation, and I'll talk with you a little bit about Ethel Walker and give some excerpts from the school's early history. And just really the early history, because we have a rich 100 plus year history, and the foundation of some of our principles that we hold dear in our school today were actually laid in the early years. So we'll mostly talk about the years reaching up to World War II. And then we'll have a Q&A afterward. So let's talk about attendee connections. Has anyone here attended Walker's or had family or friends attend Walker's? Tell me.
I happen to live here in Simsbury now, ironically.
Tell me, who are you? Kathy Smith Leonard.
62.
Class of 62. Oh, bless you for coming. I'm so thrilled that you're here. That's exciting. I had no expectation to have an alum here, so thank you. That's special. Anyone else have any connections with Walker's? Please.
We drive by it every time we do it.
Hey, that's a connection. You bet. That's a connection with Walker's. Lots of folks have been employed by this school off and on. People have walked the grounds, including through Walker's Woods, as we call it, or attended an event at Walker's, maybe our holiday ride or something like that. So I really feel if you are a member of the Simsbury community, you have a connection with Walker's. And tonight my purpose is to prove that to you and to help you to see that connection. Okay, let's talk about my purpose as well. I want to connect us all to the Ethel Walker School, to educate and inform you about some of the details of the school's history. And also, I have to admit, 7:44 at night, I want to entertain you. I hope that this turns out to be a really fun presentation because for me, education needs to be fun. So I hope that you'll bear with me as maybe I get a little goofy tonight. Okay, let's move on to my work, what I do, and how I do it. So I have 4 main areas of work that I do. I collect archival materials, I preserve them, I manage their preservation and their care, and then I share them out. And I do this both physically and digitally. So in the past, let's say in the 1930s, the head of school wanted to send a memo to her employees. She would have her receptionist type up the memo and it would be delivered by hand, paper, to people at the school. Nowadays, if our beloved Miss Viz wants to send something out, she types a glorious email. And it comes to us, and we have this digital copy. And it's my purpose as the archivist to decide, does this born digital document merit a physical birth? It's very meta. I feel like a god at times. But I also take physical documents like this scrapbook, which was donated by a woman named Ruth Mead, and I digitize it so it can be shared out. So I work both ways. And being an archivist is really keeping up with technology. As a bit of a Luddite as I am, you can see as I was struggling with the tech getting us collected tonight, I do take pride in what I do and sharing things out through technology. It's all part of accessibility, which is something that I talked about. You can think of an archives as containing the raw ingredients of history. So it's not that tidy history, rather it's the ledgers, the letters, the photos, maybe even the receipts that come together to form a story. So how is the Ethel Walker School Archives unique? This is where I get a little bit giddy and I'm very excited because it's full of the ingredients of women's history. So traditionally in many parts of the world, history has been relegated to the male sphere, written by men about men. And things that were deemed part of the women's sphere, or even the domestic sphere, were not important to the historical record. Therefore, there is a dearth of women's history. Now, I'll say that women have also been complicit in this. We have bought into the idea, or in the past, we bought into the idea that our history wasn't worthy of the grand historical record. So we didn't keep very good records. So it's very special that the Ethel Walker School is full of women's history because there's just not much women's history out there. I need to be transparent though in saying that a good chunk of the materials in the Ethel Walker School archives come from and represent a certain kind of woman. Until about the 1930s, our early population at the school was very homogeneous, very white, very upper class. So there are gaps in our archival record. And we're attempting to rectify those gaps in many ways. The documents that we have in our archives reflect the homogeneous population of our school. Here's a photo from the class of 1922, all very white, very upper class young ladies. But our later archives, especially post 1966, which is when we had our first East Asian student graduate from Walker's, they reflect a more diverse archives. So to summarize, the Ethel Walker School Archives is a rare jewel. It's full of women's history. But even among girls' schools, it's a rare jewel. And the reason it's so very special, even among girls' schools, is that we are actively building our special collections. So we are gathering objects, stuff from the past students, from present students, to help fill the gaps in our history. Because stuff, things we might not consider part of an archives, but perhaps everyday objects tell a story. So we're using artifacts and archives together to form a clearer picture of women's history. And to me, that is reason to stand up and cheer. It's so exciting. And we want to make it available to the Simsbury community and to the wider world as well. And we're working on that. So I have a little story to tell you. When I was first the archivist at Walker's a few years ago, I was asked to come in and sub for a peer of mine who had to be away. And I said, I'll come in and sub for you, but I get to bring in the archives. Is that okay? And she said, oh, of course. So I brought in some archival materials, some photos, black and white photos in a black, like a press board scrapbook. And the students got to look through these photos. They really enjoyed it. And when they were done looking through the photos, this is an example of one photo. I said, okay, great. Now I want you to choose one photo from this array that you've looked at, and I want you to create a comic strip based on that one photo. It can be fictional, make up a story. How did this pose happen? Make a story about it and create a comic strip. The students did that, and at the end of class for their homework assignment, I said, I would like you to color this comic strip. And a 7th grader's hand popped up and she said, but Ms. Thacker, they didn't have color back then. And everybody laughed, just like our response. And she immediately caught herself and she realized, okay, that was a foolish thing to say. But it got me thinking that especially students' experiences with history are often really heavily curated. We give them history books to read. We bring in photos to look at. It's so curated that often they don't understand what history really is. So how do we facilitate a more authentic experience with history? And we do that with stuff. So I have a piece of stuff here. This photo shows a young lady with a hobble skirt Coca-Cola bottle, and that's what I have right here. You can see it in the slideshow. It's stamped Hartford, Connecticut. Now the years don't exactly line up. This comes from 1951, and this photo was from the 30s. But I'm going to pass this around and let you handle it. And I want to ask you the question, if I had brought this bottle, or any of these other bottles on this table over here, into the classroom and had the students handle them and look through the scrapbook, do you think that that young lady would have raised her hand and said, they didn't have color back then, Miss Thacker? I firmly believe that the answer to connecting with history is a physical answer. With COVID, we experienced, especially when we were in the first days of quarantine, so much separation from life, from people. We were wearing masks all the time, keeping social distance, and we got used to being distant and separated. But I think that history needs to be rather intimate, even physically intimate, and that if children, or anyone, I'll dare say, can get their hands on objects from history, they'll begin to realize that they are all around them. They'll see the architecture of a building and they'll recognize, oh, I know what that is. Those are Ionic columns on the Eno Hall. They'll be able to say these things and recognize history all around them. One way that I bring history into the hands of my students and to all the students at Walker's is through on-campus kind of pseudo-archaeological excavations. And I'll explain a little bit further. I had a student a few years ago come to me and say, Ms. Thacker, I think you should go into the woods and look for stuff. And I had to laugh. I said to her, I'll take that. Thank you very much. I'll take the bottle. Thank you. And I said to her, well, where should I go into the woods to look for stuff? And she said, well, I have some bottles that I found in the woods, but I can't tell you where I found them because I wasn't supposed to be there. So the student would not tell me where she found these bottles, but I knew where she was living in her dorm, and I did a little exploration, and I found an old bottle dump. And it dates from about 1880 till about 1935. And sure enough, when I approached this area, I could see necks sticking up out of the ground. And I pulled up a couple bottles, and then I thought, this sunken area is very suspicious. I studied some archaeology in college, and I thought this could be a bottle dump site. I started to dig, and jackpot. Now, my boss, Marion, has been with me to this bottle dump and dug with me. It is so glorious and so much fun. Now, I call it a pseudo-archaeological excavation because we didn't note the stratigraphy or anything like that, because this bottle dump had been turned over a number of times over the years. It had been, there was a pipe that was brought into it so that there could be some runoff could run through the pipe. So it had been mixed up anyway. So we focused on just excavation because we knew where these materials came from. They came from the school. And so we just began to excavate. All the bottles that you'll see over on this table, these are about, I want to say, a fifth of what I've found in this bottle dump, as well as tons and tons and tons of broken glass and ceramics. So I got the big idea of taking some of these broken pieces and grinding down the edges. I do art glass as a hobby, and drilling holes in them with my diamond bit on my Dremel and making pendants, which I sell to fund our archives. And the students love wearing a piece of history. Again, it's that connection right on their heart. I'm wearing one myself. You won't be able to see it in the video, unfortunately, but you can see examples up here. And I believe that carrying something with you, even if it's just a piece of rounded off glass, because I always round the edges so nobody gets cut, carrying something like that as a lucky piece in your pocket, or wearing a necklace like that, it will remind you that history is all around you and that you are part of history. So that's something that I do with my students to help them to see that history is everywhere. Another way that I bring the Ethel Walker School archives to life is through our interactive museum. And if you'll forgive me for 1 second, I'm going to pull this up. And I neglected to pull it up beforehand, so I'm going to just do it really quickly. As you can see, I've looked it up before. But I want to show you our interactive museum because I think it's a bit special. I talked for a moment about accessibility, and this is one of my attempts to make the Ethel Walker School archives accessible. This is through a software platform that's actually free called Matterport. This is our interactive museum in Bell Library. Students come into this museum and they can touch everything. Most museums are a don't touch space. Well, the interactive museum is a please touch space. Now, naturally, there are a few cases and things where we put some treasures under acrylic glass, but most of it is please touch, please look at this. And you'll see that there are some little tags on here. You can click on a tag and you can learn more about what's being shown. So this is a way for our alum who live far away or for parents who live on the other side of the world to connect with walkers, to see what their students are becoming invested in. And the students really enjoy, especially, digging into these old library card catalog cabinets, these drawers. Some of them are filled with photos, others are filled with little impressions made of clay that my 7th graders made of permanent features of the school. So this 6, for example, comes from our Isabel Ferguson Fine Arts Theater, and it comes from the date plaque. And so the student made an impression of that and put it in the drawer. And then another student, a 6th grader, wrote a riddle to help those who opened the drawer to figure out where this impression came from. So the students are participating in the interactive museum. And I wanted them to open these drawers because it mimics the archaeology process. Discovery, open a drawer, dig your shovel in, and find something. Okay, let's get back to what we were looking at. This is a QR code, and if you're interested, you can scan this code with your phone if you have a QR reader on your phone, and you can explore the museum if you'd like to on your own time. You can also always get on the Ethel Walker School website and just hit the search button and type in Interactive Museum. Okay, so the big question is, what is it about the history of the Ethel Walker School that is so worth sharing with students? Here's some students in the museum. Well, that history starts with Ethel Walker. So now we're going to shift a little bit to talk about Ethel Walker herself and share a little bit of the early history of the school. Forgive me for 1 second while I take just a sip of water. Ethel McCoy Walker Smith was born in 1872 in London, England. She was the daughter of Colonel John Walker of the 35th Irish Regiment in the Union Army of the Civil War. But John was discharged dishonorably from the army because he had connections with his brother-in-law who decamped to the south. So John had to prove that he was, in fact, he didn't have Southern ideals. He believed in the principles of the North, and he spent his fortune that he had acquired as a newspaperman owning 2 newspapers to clear his name. He did clear his name, but impoverished, I shouldn't say impoverished. This is relatively speaking. With a lot less money, he went to England and he became a medical student at King's College. There he met the beautiful Laura Seymour. We know very little about Laura except that she was beautiful, that she was the daughter of a naval officer and a very fine cook. This again shows how there is an imbalance in the historical record that favors the male voice. They were married and they had 4 children, 3 while they were living in London, and their youngest was Ethel. When Ethel was about 3, the family returned to Indiana, where John set up his medical practice in Shelbyville, which is where the Walker family had settled years and years before, back when Indiana was the Wild West. John and Laura had a 4th child who died at birth, and John often made house calls as a doctor, and Ethel and Evangeline, who is Ethel's older sister, would go with him. Reginald, their older brother, the firstborn, was very sickly and didn't often go with them on these house calls. But they'd ride in the buggy to the different farms around Shelbyville and visit the families. And one time, Ethel and Evangeline found a woman chained up in a barn, and they ran to tell their father. And their father talked with the farmer, and he said, "This is my wife, and she's a danger to herself and others. This woman was mentally ill." And it's perhaps because of an experience like this that John turned his attention to working at the state hospital, and he became the head medical officer of the Indiana State Hospital. And that's really where Ethel grew up, was on the grounds of this state hospital. And I believe that it informed her as a person and made her very sympathetic. At the age of 11, both Ethel's father and her brother died, and Ethel's mother remarried. Now again, they were not a family of fortune, really. They were of a particular class, but had lost their fortune. And so Ethel and her sister were sent away to go to school, while Laura and her new husband kind of formed a new family in a way. And Ethel and Evangeline were very close, remained close all their lives, in spite of being physically distant from each other through their growing up, their teen years. Eventually, Ethel was able to graduate from Bryn Mawr College, where she achieved a master's degree in Greek archaeology. And this was so unusual for a woman at this time, especially in her class and status. There were really 2 or 3 avenues open to a woman of this status, and that was nursing or education. And Ethel was academic by nature, so she chose education. She taught history for quite a while, and then she began to work for the Rockefeller Institute in New York. But she just didn't feel fulfilled, and she began to search for something more. This is from her memoir, from a letter that she wrote to the alumni in the class of 1924. This is Ethel at the age where she started her school, which was about 38. "What made me decide to start a school? It is a sort of compelling force that moves groups and individuals to widen their horizon. And to that pioneer class, I seemed to belong. The moment came when I wanted freedom of expression and action, and the opportunity to create something of my own." She wanted this. She yearned to start her own school. But the big problem was that Ethel was not well off. Evangeline was quite well off. She had married Charles McLean Andrews, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and historian and professor at Yale. But Evangeline was not in charge of her own income or her husband's income, not in charge of her money. So she offered more moral support to Ethel, although a bit of financial support as well. But what Ethel really needed was an investor. Enter Carola Warishifer. This young woman was an heiress, and I love this story. She was so wealthy, so young, a graduate of Bryn Mawr and a good friend of Evangeline's. And she donated to many worthy causes, but she also worked undercover for what would be the burgeoning CIA at the time. She would work for the State Department and infiltrate the working situations that women and children were involved in. So like giant laundries where women and children were employed as laundresses. She would infiltrate that, and she would become a member of this clan of workers to find out how the circumstances were for these women and children. And then she would report back to the State Department. And you can bet she made some enemies in this way. Interestingly, she was returning from one of these undercover operations with another passenger in her vehicle she was driving, and she had an accident and she was killed, and the other passenger walked away. To me, that smacks of mystery, but maybe that's just story coming up. And the most important thing I think that we can take from this is that the Ethel Walker School was literally built on women helping women. That's a story that we carry with us from the time that Carola Warishifer donated the money to Ethel Walker to today. We believe in women helping women. Ethel was able to establish her school on October 3rd, 1911 in Lakewood, New Jersey, which was really a summer community. And so her first dormitory was actually a summer home. And this was fraught with difficulty. For one thing, it was not set up as a school, it was set up as a home. But the school was small enough. There were 10 boarding students, 2-day students, 7 teachers, that for a while it worked in Lakewood. Now, the reason I'd like to talk about these early years in Lakewood is because this is where some of our traditions sprang up as well. So Evangeline Walker Andrews was credited with kind of bringing back the traditional dances of merry old England to Bryn Mawr, which was her alma mater as well. And Ethel brought those same traditional dances to Walker's. The picture in the right-hand side is from 1912, the first maypole dance that they held. And this is from last year, our May festivities. And if you drive past the school on a fine May day, you may see our maypole up and the students dancing around, and the students in reds and oranges divided from students in blues and purples. We'll talk about that in a second. Here's a cute little video that I wanted to show you. This is from 1928, and this is the handkerchief dance that the students performed. This is an actual video from our school's archives. It shows some of the dancing that they did, and it's not a high quality video, but it was the 20s. And you can just see the maypole. So they did this adorable little dance. So fun. The school's 2 spirit groups also started in this first year. While at supper, the first night, these 10 students were gathered together with their teachers, and one student mistook a pepper grinder for a little sundial. And everybody laughed, and it kind of broke the tension of this first dinner. And the sundial became the school's emblem. And shortly after, that same student with a friend came to Ethel Walker and said, could we have 2 spirit groups, the suns and the dials? And the suns chose sun colors, warm colors. And the dials chose purple and blue. And really the 2 colors that have stuck with the school were yellow and purple. Now, interestingly, the Bryn Mawr College colors are purple, and graduate school yellow. So that may have influenced the purple and yellow. However, the colors for the National Women's Party, the suffrage party, were also purple and yellow. And this was happening right then. Women were beginning to talk about having the right to vote. So that may have influenced the colors for the Ethel Walker School. And maybe the Women's Suffrage Party took their colors from Bryn Mawr. We don't know. But speaking of suffrage, when the school moved to Simsbury, it purchased a Dodge estate that abutted another Dodge estate, the Josephine Jewell Dodge estate. And if you know anything about Josephine Jewell Dodge, she was the leader of the anti-suffrage movement. And one of her best friends was Antoinette Eno Wood, one of the leaders of the suffrage movement. And her neighbor was Ethel Walker, who was obviously a progressive woman. And yet these three women maintained a friendship. And I think that's rather remarkable. Now, when I first began to research Josephine Dodge, I thought, surely this woman is rolling over in her grave knowing that this all-girls progressive college preparatory school is right on her doorstep. But the more I got to know Josephine through my research, I realized that this was a high-class, wealthy matriarch of a large family. She had no trouble having her voice heard. So it's a complicated story. And if you'd like to learn more about Josephine Jewell Dodge, I recommend looking into the Simsbury Historical Society and the Avon Historical Society. They've both done wonderful work kind of celebrating who Josephine Jewell Dodge was as a person, not just as an anti-suffragist, and then also Antoinette Eno Wood, who is very fascinating. So let's continue to talk about the move from Lakewood to Simsbury. By the school's 6th year in New Jersey, 1917, there were about 45 students spread out in 3 summer homes across Lakewood, which was just not ideal. And house mother Elizabeth Sargent learned that there were 3 large Dodge estates for sale in Simsbury. And Simsbury was a very posh place to settle. It was where a lot of the New York families spent their summers. They would winter in Manhattan, summer in Simsbury. The estates were offered at a low price because 1917 was a war year, and also some members of the Dodge family were suffering from illnesses. So these homes were offered at a really low price, fully furnished. So the estates included many desirable riding paths in what was called the Bushy Hill Woods, and which we now know as the Ethel Walker Woods, which were sold in 2007 to the town of Simsbury to be held in perpetuity as a public open space, public walking space. The woods connect to Town Forest Park and Stratton Brook Park, and they stand atop an enormous Level A aquifer. They were farmland. Now they're timbered, and they host more than 300 species of plants and animals. So the existence of the riding paths in these Walker's Woods certainly contributed to Ethel's eagerness to purchase these properties, because riding had always been a huge part of her program, and Ethel rode astride. I will tell you that that says something about who she was in a time when many women were riding side saddle. Ethel rode astride. She rode a black stallion. She was only 4'11". She rode a black stallion 16 hands high named Lucifer. So she was actually that's wrong. His name was Satan, not Lucifer. Regardless, she was daring. So in about 1929, a new riding ring was built on the Ethel Walker property. And at the time, it was considered second to none. Really, the only riding ring that could rival it at all was the West Point riding ring. And since that time, Walker's has remained top of its class for riding. And many students come to Walker's with that as their main draw, and they get a really good education to boot. We make sure of that. But riding has always been a draw. You'll see right here, this circle. So this is facing out toward Talcott Mountain. You might very faintly see Hubeline Tower there. So this was taken after 1914, which was when the tower was built. This was the original riding ring. Now our riding ring is across the street. So if you imagine Bushy Hill Road in front of the screen, across the street is where our riding ring is now. But if you walk these woods, those pines are still there in a circle. So I'm going to talk for just a little bit about landscape and properties and the school's landscape and properties. But before I do that, I want to recognize that the land that Walker's stands on was, before colonization, the home of the Tunxus people, particularly the Masako group, which settled along the Farmington River. I want to honor these people. I also want to state, and so proudly state, that I and the Ethel Walker School as an educational institution are committed to continuing to right the wrongs that were done to Native Americans. I'm proud to say that social justice, equity, and inclusivity are active driving forces at Walker's. We know that Native Americans at least frequented the landscape that the Ethel Walker School sits on. And the reason we know that is because in the spring of 2005, we invited local archaeologist Mark Banks to conduct a survey of the property. And that survey yielded about 227 stone points or debitage. And debitage is the flakes that result from the creation of stone points. And all these points and the debitage are with Yukon right now. And the survey said, the distribution and types of the artifacts suggest brief camps and or hunting stands, with 2 areas of Walker's Woods closer to Stratton Brook, suggesting longer stops by Native American groups. And these groups surely included the Masako, of whom I just spoke. This slide shows the properties that Ethel Walker purchased for her school. This is an aerial view from 1934. And to orient you, this is Beaver Brook, the main school building. This is Bushy Hill Road. This is Sand Hill Road. Okay? Up here in the top in green, we have the Norman White Dodge property. This is not the true borders, it's just to orient you really. And Norman's brother was David Stewart Dodge, and he owned the landscape where, and the home really, where the main buildings of Ethel Walker stand right now. There was also David Stewart Dodge's son, who was named Walter Phelps Dodge, who had a big house across the street up on the hill, which some of you might remember, and actually may have lived in. Yeah. And we'll talk about that house. I'd love to hear from you about that. And then this is Josephine Jewell Dodge's and Arthur Murray Dodge's property, which is to the east of the school property. So the building, which Ethel Walker originally established as the main school headquarters, was called Belhurst, and it was the summer home of Reverend David Stewart Dodge. And these are photos. This photo and this next one were given to me by Susan Allison Karp. They were actually sent to Miss Viz, who passed them along to me. Her grandfather worked to electrify Walkers. And here he is here and here. And these young men worked in 1917 to bring Belhurst, which was what the David Stewart Dodge family called their summer home, to a point where it could be a suitable school. They also built what was known as a sleeping porch onto the school. Here's the original photo. The sleeping porch was an all-weather porch where girls slept outside with canvas walls around them. And a poor father took pity on these poor girls and bought them all fur coats to wear to bed. And they would sometimes wake up in the night with drifts of snow coming under the canvas. But by all accounts, they loved the sleeping porch. Now, if you'll remember, I mentioned that the schoolhouse mother, Elizabeth Sargent, had been kind of the one to clue into these Dodge properties being sold. She got her sister, whose name was Rhoda Sargent Tilney, to take over what was called Pettibone Tavern. We now know it as Abigail's Grill. And they ran Pettibone Tavern as basically the school's tavern and inn. It was like an extension of the school, and the students traipsed down there because it was within walking distance for lunches and tea with their parents. And it was a very favorite place for students to visit. And these are some photos that I've shared with the folks at Abigail's that come from our archives. This one is from about 1935. Here are some students in 1939 gathered outside. And here are some advertisements that were found in the back of some old yearbooks from 1922 through 1940. And they show just some of the very simple advertisements that were pointing people to go to Pettibone Tavern. And people could purchase an ad in the back of the yearbook to support the yearbook and to pay for the yearbook. So the backs of the early yearbooks were filled with these ads. And here's another collection from the 1922 yearbook that shows some other Simsbury businesses. The Ensign Bickford Company, Wilcox and Company, selling coal, cement, lime, and lumber. A.E. Lathrop, registered pharmacist, and the Simsbury Bank and Trust, and Simsbury Electric. We'll talk for a minute about the Norman White Dodge home, which was on the north end of the aerial photo that I showed you. This was a 32-room Queen Anne Victorian beautiful mansion, wood mansion mostly, and it served as the dormitory for the youngest students, and it was also an infirmary. And it was located where what is now the St. Albans Church is located. So if you drive behind St. Albans, they have a large area of acreage, about 11 acres, devoted to walking sanctuary. You can go and visit that. And this is where that home stood. And just this past fall, I took congregants from St. Albans Church on a walk out there and showed them where the house used to be and the remnants of the old Victorian gardens. I showed them where there was an old track, a running track, a cinder running track. There's what Four Corners looks like today. They called it Four Corners, this building, because it stood at the corner of Stratton Brook Road and Bushy Hill Road, and they called that Four Corners. So the dorm was called Four Corners. So speaking of a running track, we had an Olympian train on this track. Her name was Nancy Van Voorhees, class of 1924, and as a 15-year-old in 1922, she participated on the first women's Olympic level track team. And she participated in Paris and tied for gold in the long jump with, the high jump with a young woman from England. Now you'll remember that I mentioned that the school was able to finally purchase the Walter Phelps Dodge House in 1919. Now you're recognizing this building. So let's talk about some fun facts about this house. It was built in 1616 in England. It was shipped beam by beam and stone by stone to Simsbury. The door, which we have still in Beaverbrook, has a quote on it from Baron Gervase Clifton, which says, "Be with ye ever peace and grace." Baron Gervase Clifton was one of a long line of sheriffs of Nottingham. So our seniors who lived in this dormitory lived in the place owned by the sheriff of Nottingham. Maybe that's why they were so naughty. And I love to tell this story because it seems to me that students need to learn about the history of the places they are residing. They give off energy in a space, and they can take the energy from the space. So I love to tell that story. The home was renamed the Emily Cluett House, and it was called that because in 1919, Emily Cluett passed away from the influenza, and she was a senior at Walker's. And her family, in gratitude for Ethel's care of their daughter, donated a large sum of money that allowed them to purchase that final Dodge estate that the school didn't own, the one across the street that I showed you in the aerial photo. And it became the senior dormitory, and was the senior dormitory until the late 60s, when it was deemed uninhabitable. Because remember, it had been first built in 1616. So it was demolished, and the new Cluett building was built, and students began to live there. What was Cluett like, the Emily Cluett House?
It was heartbreaking to hear it was demolished.
Yes, I'm sure it was heartbreaking.
So many living in there, this massive fireplaces, and
Oh.
5 of us in one room, all in there. It's the most incredible place, beautiful.
I'll need to pull up some photos to share with you. So for the benefit of the video, it was heartbreaking to see this building demolished. There was a sunken living room and a grand fireplace with ornate carvings, and 5 girls to a room. The windows had leaded glass. It was just very beautiful. And we're thrilled to have someone who lived there.
I'm so lucky to there when before it got demolished. It was nice.
Absolutely.
We were all horrified to see what they put there instead.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It was built in 1616. It was over 350 years old when it was demolished. But, you know, it's heartbreaking to see a really old place torn down. So real quickly, let's finish up what we were talking about today. In 1921, Ethel got married in the Emily Cluett House, and she stepped away from being the acting headmistress of the school. She was still, in name, the head of the school until 1965, when she died at the age of 93. And she was always very active in service of the school, even inviting students every year, the entire school, to come to her house in West Hartford for picnics and swimming. And she was an avid swimmer. She loved to swim. In 1925, this is what Beaverbrook looked like. A gymnasium had been added, which you can see here to the left of that portico. And then in 1933, 4 days apart, Beaverbrook and Four Corners burned to the ground. Newspapers from the time talk about how small fires had been set, and eventually, though, the authorities deemed this as faulty wiring. Now, whether or not it was arson, the school was able to collect the insurance money from these destroyed buildings, and in 1933, which was the bottom of the Great Depression, able to employ a lot of Simsbury men to work day and night to rebuild the school so that it could open in the fall of 1933, 6 months later. And this is what the home looked like, what Beaverbrook looked like after it was built. So it had some things that remained the same. And you'll notice the gymnasium was the only thing that didn't burn down in those two huge fires, and that's because it had been built to a more modern standard, modern code. In 1999, Beaverbrook underwent a renovation, and outwardly the really noticeable difference is that there's no longer a flat roof. Instead, there's a gambrel-style roof, which we have, and you can see that the front entrance has changed a little bit. So there are two photos side by side. So there are some other changes that really started in the 30s. And in 1938, one of those big changes was that one of our first Latinx students, Alina Maria Johnson de Menocal from Havana, Cuba, graduated from Walker's, and we began to admit Latinx students. There were other changes. Some were a little bit more giggly laughable, not necessarily social justice changes, but in some ways, small justices. For example, in 1939, the school eliminated garter check. They didn't check to see that the girls were wearing their garters so that their socks wouldn't tumble down around their ankles in little donut rolls. So that was a small triumph for these students. And I've marked their garter areas with orange boxes for their own modesty. Another funny little aside is that in 1938, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda Fitzgerald's daughter, Frances, known as Frankie, graduated from Walker's. And by all accounts, she was a bit of a firebrand and a little bit mischievous, but a lot of fun. And then in the 1940s, big changes started to happen at the school. The student-written newspaper, which is called the Sundial, and which started in 1939 and ran until 2005, and is now, the Sundial is now our school's magazine. It was a student-run newspaper, and you can see that students were invested in what was going on around the world with World War II. This article says, "Pro and Con argues women's position in post-war world. Should women take back seat when the boys come home? Should women stay at the wheel, maintain legitimate rights?" So this was a time when the girls at Walker's began to see that change was afoot, and they began to participate in this change. And before I conclude, I'd like to tell you about one change maker, and we'll just leave this with her. Her name was Rosalind Palmer, class of 1942, and she was the inspiration for the Rosie the Riveter song. So before Rosie became this model phenom, there was actually a song about her. And Rosalind graduated from Walker's and went to work in the Vought aircraft manufacturing company. And she was working one day and was interviewed by a man who came in to see what the girls were doing in the aircraft company. And the article kind of got syndicated, went viral in today's terms. And it was picked up, the idea for the song was picked up. And this is how it goes. We'll see if I can get a little sound with it from just my computer. Oh, I'm sorry, let's go back. See if we can get it.
All the day long, where the rain has shined, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the riveter, keeps a sharp lookout for sabotage. Sitting up there on the fuselage, that little frail can do more than a man can do. Rosie, The riveter, Rosa's got a boyfriend, Charlie.
We'll stop there. It's an adorable song, and I recommend that you check it out. It's really fun. We actually had a lot of alumni get involved with the war effort. One became a pilot and was sabotaged by men who were not pleased that she was flying planes, who put sugar in her gas tank and caused her to crash. There are some really exciting stories that I'd love to share at another time. But right now, I want to thank you for your attention and see if there are any questions. I'd love to take questions. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, please.
Just, first of all, a comment. I have enjoyed Walker property for 4 or 5 years now. I'm a member of the community garden that they so generously share with the public.
Yes.
And I've done quite a bit of hiking in the Walker Woods.
Oh, wonderful.
I appreciate it.
Can you summarize? Can you summarize what he said?
I will, absolutely. Thank you, Mark. He said that he's been able to walk Walker's grounds for many years, working in the community gardens, which the school has offered that property to the Simsbury community. I love to walk around the gardens and admire everybody's growing. It must be a magical sight because a lot grows right there. Who knows, maybe that's where the horses were pastured for quite a while. But there are also some really great walking trails that he's been able to walk walk around on. So thank you. Any other thoughts, comments, or questions? Please.
The school is not co-ed, right?
The school is not co-ed. No, it's a girls' school. It has been from its very foundation.
When might that change?
There have been times in the past, so the question was, is the school co-ed? And the answer is no, it's an all-girls school. There have been times in the past that it was considered. For example, other all-girls schools have gone co-ed, especially in the 60s and early 70s when financial constraints were really pressing. But because Walker's was built on very large amounts of property, during those difficult times when money was a little tight, we were able to sell off some land and have enough funding to continue to fund our school. And we still have quite a lot of acreage and property. But we managed, we got through it, and we're gonna be all girls for the foreseeable future, I think. Any other questions? Eric.
Yeah, just to say I'm the beneficiary of a lucky coincidence. I went to Williams College where the colors were purple and yellow.
Williams
and
College.
the letter W, so you can see that my Williams hat is perfectly.
Perfect. Perfect. So Eric said, for the benefit of the video, that he went to Williams College where the colors were purple and yellow, and that fits perfectly with Walker's because he has a baseball cap with a W on it, and it's purple and yellow. We're lucky. I have here on this table a bunch of bottles. Touch them. They're here for you to touch, to pick up. There's one that has a beaver on the base. See if you can find that one. There are also some small objects in a case, and they're just tiny. You can hold them close, or you can take them out. I'm fine if you take them out too. But I'll walk over there with you, and we can take a look at those things. And thank you so much.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.